Tenemos el privilegio de tener a dos grandes investigadoras en psicología y específicamente en psicología del desarrollo que van a compartir con nosotros de manera generosa conocimientos acerca del desarrollo sociomoral de las personas que crecen en contextos marcados por la adversidad y específicamente por la violencia. Las charlas están enmarcadas también en la inauguración de nuestro doctorado, programa que comenzó este año, a comienzos del año, y que tendrá su segunda convocatoria formal, porque hubo una informal a mitad de año, segunda convocatoria formal en este momento para el 2016-1. Quisimos, dentro de la serie de conferencias, charlas académicas que se han dado para precisamente promocionar nuestro doctorado, pedirles el favor a las doctoras Recchia de la Universidad de Concordia en Canadá y a la doctora Cecilia Wenrich, que es la profesora de la Universidad de Utah en los Estados Unidos, que compartieran con nosotros conocimiento acerca del desarrollo social de los niños creciendo en contextos de adversidad. También estas charlas están relacionadas, y específicamente por eso yo estoy presentando este evento en el día de hoy. Están relacionadas con el trabajo que venimos haciendo en el Laboratorio de Cognición y Desarrollo, laboratorio que coordino yo, y específicamente de la línea de desarrollo sociomoral en contextos adversos. La doctora Recchia nos hablará precisamente de un proyecto que venimos realizando desde hace un par de años en colaboración con Cecilia Wenrich y conmigo, y por supuesto con mis estudiantes de maestría, y que comenzó alguna de ellas, Lisette, desde el pregrado. La relevancia de las charlas pienso que es completamente clara y notoria. Nos van a hablar inicialmente la doctora Recchia sobre nuestro estudio sobre experiencias de perdón y no perdón en conflictos interpersonales de jóvenes que han crecido en diferentes o que han tenido experiencias diferentes con respecto a exposición a violencia, a la organización y clima que tienen sus colegios, y a cuestiones de salud mental. La doctora Recchia es profesora asistente del Departamento de Estudios de la Niñez y Educación en la Universidad de Concordia en Canadá. La investigación de la doctora Recchia se centra en cómo el desarrollo social y moral de los niños ocurre dentro del contexto de sus relaciones cercanas con padres, hermanos y amigos. Ella está especialmente interesada en cómo los niños le hallan sentido y cómo resuelven sus conflictos con otros. Actualmente la doctora Recchia recibe estudiantes de posgrado en educación y en estudios de la niñez, y específicamente de doctorado en educación. Recchia hizo estudios de psicología desde 1998 al 2003, donde terminó graduada con honores en psicología y estudios aplicados en la Universidad de Waterloo. Posteriormente hizo su maestría desde el 2003 al 2005 en el Centro de Investigación, y lo voy a leer en inglés, en el Center for Research in Human Development en la Universidad de Concordia en Canadá. Del 2005 al 2009 llevó a cabo sus estudios de doctorado nuevamente continuamente en la misma universidad, la Universidad de Concordia, y del 2009 al 2010 estuvo haciendo un postdoc con la doctora Cecilia Wendrip en la Universidad de Utah. No sobra comentarles que Holly Recchia es una persona, una académica joven, supremamente productiva, brillante y una excelente investigadora, metodóloga grandiosa y que ha publicado, que tiene una lista de publicaciones extensa para su relativamente corta carrera. Ha publicado alrededor más de 20 artículos, ha editado un libro recientemente en el 2014, específicamente quiero mencionarlo, que se llama Mother-Child Conversations About Hurting Others, Supporting the Construction of Moral Agency Through Childhood and Adolescence, libro que fue editado con la doctora Cecilia Wendrip. Y como les digo, más de una decena de publicaciones en artículos y decenas de presentaciones en las principales conferencias de psicología del desarrollo. Como les decía, sus intereses de investigación tienen que ver con cómo los niños hayan sentido los conflictos dentro de relaciones diferentes y cómo esas experiencias cambian con la edad. También cómo las características particulares de las relaciones cercanas de los niños con hermanos y amigos se relacionan con cómo ellos comprenden y resuelven sus conflictos con compañeros. Además, le interesa saber cómo los niños de diferentes edades describen sus experiencias de perdón y no perdón cuando son victimizados por otros. Otro tema en el que trabaja o ha trabajado es en cómo se relaciona el desarrollo sociomoral de los niños con sus experiencias de violencia e injusticia, y más específicamente cómo la exposición a violencia está relacionada a las narrativas de los conflictos de estos niños. Y finalmente, y pues haciendo un resumen de todos sus intereses, ¿cuál es el rol de los educadores para apoyar el desarrollo ético de los niños? Démosle una bienvenida a la doctora Recchia, por favor. Olvidé decir, la presentación de la doctora Recchia será en inglés. Yo le pedí el favor de que hablara lentamente, como lo hizo en alguna charla anterior Cristina Gordon. Creo que para todos es entendible. Ella hablará despacio, ¿cierto? Are you going to talk slowly? Okay. Las diapositivas fueron hechas en español para ayudar a comprender, probablemente para los que se les dificulte un poco más el idioma. Gracias.
I'm very happy to be here. I've been doing this work now since 2012, but this is my first chance to present it to a Colombian audience. So I'm very much looking forward to the feedback and questions that you'll have about this, because you know more about this than most of the audiences that I've presented to thus far. So the title of my talk in English is Colombian Youth's Experiences of Revenge and Forgiveness in Peer Conflict. When a person feels that they've been wronged or they've been hurt, they have to make a decision about how to respond. These decisions could involve forgiving or not forgiving. They could also involve seeking revenge versus turning away from revenge. Although it's often suggested that forgiveness and revenge are two sides of the same coin or opposites, we suggest that the links or the associations between forgiveness and revenge may actually be somewhat more complex, especially in youth exposed to adversity. So for this reason, we're examining forgiveness and revenge as two distinct dimensions of youth's experiences. Research has shown so far that fairly clear that condemning revenge and endorsing forgiveness have each been linked to positive outcomes. And when I say positive outcomes, I mean both at the intrapersonal level, so youth's social and psychological adjustment, as well as the interpersonal level, so in terms of developing healthy relationships and avoiding escalating cycles of conflict with others. Another thing that has become increasingly clear is that youth's experiences with violence and injustice contribute to the belief that revenge is a legitimate response to provocation. In turn, this belief about revenge can perpetuate cycles of violence. So in other words, youth's positive judgments of revenge seem to mediate the association between exposure to violence and youth aggression. However, to date, the process whereby youth's experiences with violence contribute to these positive judgments of revenge is not well understood. So we know that when youth are exposed to more violence, they tend to judge revenge more positively, but it's not clear how their interpretations of their experiences and how they make sense of events in their lives lead them to this place where they believe that revenge is a positive way of solving conflicts. In turn, as far as forgiveness, very little research has explored how violence and injustice may be related to youth's judgments of forgiveness and non-forgiveness. And this is particularly true in the context of interpersonal conflict between peers, for example, rather than intergroup conflict between countries. Okay, so this investigation had a lot of questions. So the first set of questions surrounded how Colombian youth describe their experiences of revenge and forgiveness in peer conflict. And more specifically, we were interested in, first of all, to what extent do youth talk about wanting revenge? When they get into conflict with peers, how much do they describe desires for getting back at others? How much do they describe actually acting out these desires? So whether they want revenge, when they want revenge, it doesn't necessarily imply that they'll actually get revenge. So how much do youth act out these desires? What reasons do they describe for either acting out revenge or turning away from revenge? With respect to forgiveness, what reasons do youth give for either forgiving or not forgiving a peer who has hurt them? So how do youth describe how they arrive at a place of forgiveness or non-forgiveness? And finally, in addition to how youth describe their experiences, we're also interested in how youth evaluate their experiences or judge their experiences. And so we also ask how youth evaluate their own retaliation, their forgiveness, and their non-forgiveness. The second major set of questions concern how all of these descriptions and evaluations are related to individual differences in youth's experiences of violence and injustice. So when youth are exposed to higher levels of violence, do they describe and evaluate their conflicts differently? So to examine these questions, we recruited about 100 participants from 4 schools in and around Bogota. The schools varied in terms of the characteristics of the schools themselves, so how much violence occurred in the schools, as well as the characteristics of the neighborhoods, so the levels of community violence that occurred around the schools. The age of the youth was approximately 16 years. They varied in age from, for the most part, 15 to 17 years. As I said, the recruitment sites varied in terms of their characteristics, and that was intentional because we wanted to, as I said, examine links with exposure to violence, so we aimed to recruit youth with varied experiences. So the first set of questions relate to how youth describe and also evaluate their experiences of revenge and forgiveness in peer conflict. So how we answered these questions is by asking participants to provide us with 2 narrative accounts of experiences in which they were hurt by a peer. So we asked youth to tell us about a time when a kid did something or said something to them and it made them feel very hurt and angry. And we asked them about times that they were so angry that they wanted to get back at the person who hurt them. In one situation, we asked them about a time that they ended up forgiving that peer. And in the other event, we asked them about a time that they ended up not forgiving that peer. And the order in which we asked about these events varied across participants, so we counterbalanced it. The first thing we did in terms of looking at revenge or retaliation was we coded these narrative accounts for spontaneous references to retaliatory desires. So what youth told us in their stories about their situations of wanting retaliation, as well as whether these desires were actually acted out. So whether they actually got revenge or whether they turned away from revenge. We also asked some follow-up questions to explore retaliatory desires more explicitly. In particular, we asked, when you were the most angry or upset, what did you feel like doing or saying to that person? And did you end up doing or saying any of that? And why or why not? Just to give you a sense of the sorts of things that youth talked to us about, we coded 2 distinct types of retaliation. The first is what we're calling an eye for an eye, or tit for tat, which are retaliations in which youth essentially described responding in the same way as they were hurt. So if someone hit them, they wanted to hit them back. If someone insulted their family, they wanted to insult the person's family. So I won't read through this example, I'll let you read through it, but this first example here is an instance of tit for tat retaliation. The second type that we looked at, we called other harmful actions, which were basically retaliations that did not take the same form as the original provocation. Most of these were escalatory, so in other words, situations where somebody might insult you and you punch them in the face. And most of them were physically aggressive, so violent, as opposed to being insults, for example. Just to give you an overall picture of the sorts of things that youth talk to us about, most of the conflicts involved verbal offensive behavior. So things like, she called me fat, he insulted my mother, he said I don't have any friends. But there were quite high rates of physical violence in this sample relative to comparable data that we've collected in the United States in a community sample of youth who were not exposed to violence. So in the US, we found that among adolescents, about 3% of conflicts involved physical violence, whereas in this sample, it was about 20%. Okay? So it was not the majority of the conflicts, but it was certainly more prevalent in relative terms than we have seen elsewhere. Okay, so here are the results in terms of what we saw both in the narratives and in response to follow-up questions about how much youth desired revenge and how much they actually acted out those desires. So just to walk you through the figure a little bit, on your left, you see the descriptions of retaliation in the narratives. So in about slightly more than 40% of narratives, youth talked about wanting retaliation. And in about 80% of those situations, so 4 out of 5 of those desires were actually enacted. So most of the time in the narratives when youth talked about wanting retaliation, they also talked about actually getting revenge. In terms of the pattern in follow-up questions, when we asked more directly about retaliatory desires, in any given story, about 70% of youth described wanting retaliation. About 1 1/3 of these desires were enacted. So what we saw, essentially, in response to the follow-up questions is that youth didn't necessarily integrate always their desires for retaliation into their narratives, but when we asked more directly about responses, they tended to describe, concrete instances of wanting retaliation. I think the most striking finding on this figure is that there is no finding in terms of forgiveness versus non-forgiveness. So what we see in blue are the stories about situations where youth forgave their peer, and in orange, the situations where youth did not forgive their peer. There were virtually no differences. So both in terms of wanting retaliation and actually getting revenge, forgiveness and non-forgiveness were identical. This is not what we see in a community sample in the United States. What we see among youth who have been exposed to very low levels of violence in the US is that they desire revenge more often in non-forgiveness stories, and they also enact revenge more often in non-forgiveness stories. So there seems to be something different going on here. The next thing we examined was youth's reasons for why they sought revenge and why they turned away from revenge. So to get a sense of, their thinking and how they made sense of these behaviors. There were three main types of reasons that youth used to explain why they got revenge or why they acted out their revenge desires. The first set of reasons we called emotionally driven. The sorts of things that youth said in these cases implied a reactive response. So for those of you who are familiar with the reactive-proactive distinction, these responses were reactive in the sense that they were responding to powerful emotions that impelled them to act. It wasn't that these were calculated, thoughtful responses. They were just really mad and they lashed out. The second type of reason was a bit more reflective or perhaps proactive, although it's an odd usage in this context. But in this case, they did sound a little bit more calculated. These responses were aimed at making themselves feel better. So I got revenge because I thought I would not be so upset anymore. I wouldn't be so angry. At making the other person feel worse. So I wanted him to feel as hurt as I did, or to somehow redress the balance of how they were feeling and how the other person was feeling. So I thought it would make him feel worse and me feel better at the same time. Finally, one of the most frequent categories of responses we're calling general provocation. And essentially what youth did here is emphasize the harm that was done to them. So how these responses sounded was, he hit me and so I hit him. Point blank. There's nothing else to say. Right? Really what was most characteristic and perhaps troubling about these cases is that youth really failed to elaborate on the psychology underlying their own experiences of revenge. So they didn't talk about their emotions, they didn't talk about their beliefs or cognitions, they didn't talk about their goals. It was as though there was nothing to be explained. Cecilia will elaborate a little bit more on this pattern in terms of what it means with respect to distortions in moral agency, but this is a pattern that we find particularly troubling. Now, we were also very interested in the reasons that youth described turning away from revenge. So the kinds of containment strategies they were using when they wanted revenge, what made them stop and turn away and not actually act that out. Overall, we found that some of the reasons reflected a kind of internal source of motivation that implied resilience, or that speaks to potential sources of resilience. On the other hand, other reasons did not. So first of all, let me tell you about the reasons that we see as somewhat more promising. The first set here were negative judgments of retaliating. So basically you said retaliation is not a good thing to do. It's a bad thing. It's not something I want to do. Although these reasons weren't necessarily moral all the time, so sometimes they would say things like, I would never hit a girl, which is, for those of you who are familiar with social domain theory, it's more of a social conventional reason. They did suggest, however, that youth were critically reflecting on retaliation as a response. Even more promising were reasons that implied that revenge was inconsistent with youth's broader understandings of themselves. So this is what we were calling self-reflective self-reflective reasons. And finally, some youth described clearly moral concerns, suggesting a reluctance to harm other people, so I really didn't want to hurt him, despite the fact that he hurt me, or also a reluctance to damage relationships. On the less optimistic side, two very common reasons for turning away from revenge were also, in the first case, fear of further victimization. So youth described being afraid of being hurt again if they retaliated, or feeling powerless or outnumbered. Another frequent response was that youth anticipated negative responses from authority figures, like teachers or school personnel, that they would get in trouble, essentially, if they retaliated. Clearly, this reason is problematic on its own, as it suggests that youth may only do the right thing when they perceive that someone is watching. All right, so then we were also interested in how youth evaluated or judged their own retaliatory actions. We found that 60 out of the 97 youth described actually retaliating at least once across the two events. And so for these situations, we asked them, when you did that, when you punched him back, do you think it was okay or not okay for you to do that? Here are the findings. We did find that in about 45% of cases, youth said it was not okay that they retaliated. And this was for a variety of reasons, similar to the reasoning about turning away from revenge or acting out revenge. On the other hand, the rest of the participants either made a mixed judgment of retaliation, so they said it was sort of okay, sort of not okay, or they actually made a positive judgment of retaliation. So 30% of youth just said when they retaliated, that was okay. So what we see here is considerable heterogeneity or variations in youth's evaluations, and I'll return to this a bit later in terms of how these are related to youth's exposure to violence. Okay, turning for a moment to forgiveness. We also asked youth about their reasons for forgiving and not forgiving in the aftermath of being harmed. There were two particularly common reasons that youth described forgiving a peer who had hurt them. The first reflected stable concerns with the importance of the relationship with the person who had hurt them. So she's my friend. She's someone I want to stay friends with. She's not someone who I want to end this relationship with. And the second reflected or included descriptions of the offender being remorseful. So he felt bad for what he did, he tried to make it up to me, or he apologized. One challenge that we perceive with the second reason is that it suggests that forgiveness, when it's being justified in this way, might actually be difficult in the absence of such overtures by the offender. So when someone is not remorseful or someone is not apologizing, this makes forgiveness quite difficult. In terms of the most common reasons for not forgiving, one common reason was just that, the offense was a really big deal. The harm that was done to them was just in some ways unforgivable. Or they had such a strong emotional response to the harm that it made forgiveness impossible. They were just too angry or too hurt. Now, it is possible, and many people are doing great work in terms of helping youth to overcome negative emotions and get beyond conflict in that way. But other responses that fit into this category really seem to imply that certain behaviors are simply unforgivable. This is problematic in as much as it makes it impossible to overcome certain kinds of harms in the service of mending relationships. The second major set of responses tended to refer to the negative characteristics of the offender, the person who had hurt them. So they might suggest things like the other's remorselessness, a history of harm, and in such situations, ending a relationship may actually be a legitimate and constructive way to protect yourself from further harm. If someone is hurting you and hurting you and hurting you and hurting you and remorseless about it, maybe you don't want to be friends with that person anymore. On the other hand, other instances of these responses also suggested very retributive motivations to really teach the other person a lesson for their bad behavior. Okay, so we also asked youth, in addition to describing forgiveness, to evaluate forgiveness. So we said, when you think about everything that happened between you and Cecilia, do you think it was a good thing or not such a good thing that you forgave her? And, in the other situation, when you think about everything that happened with your other peer, Roberto, do you think it was a good thing or not such a good thing that you didn't forgive him? Well, okay, I don't know. It looks bad on my screen, but I think you can read it. So what we found is that youth, almost across the board, almost every participant, or above 80%, said that forgiveness was a good thing. That when they forgave, it was a good thing that they had forgiven. They were very unequivocal about that. On the other hand, there was considerably more variation in terms of whether they thought non-forgiveness was a good thing. So in fact, it was quite common for youth to make either mixed judgments of non-forgiveness, so it was sort of good and sort of not good, or to even say flat out it was a good thing that I didn't forgive him. Now, if we didn't have similar data in the US, we might be tempted to think this implies the high-risk nature of this sample. But in fact, what we see among adolescents, in safe neighborhoods in the United States, is the identical pattern. It's an interesting developmental story in terms of as kids get older, they're more likely to talk in this way, but it doesn't seem to imply a particular source of risk. It seems to imply that adolescents are thinking about non-forgiveness in complex ways. However, that being said, it still opens the door to looking at individual differences. So when youth are exposed to more violence, do they make more positive judgments of non-forgiveness? Okay, so that brings us to the final set of questions, which relate to how individual differences or variations between youth in these patterns are related to youth's experiences with violence and injustice. So we had two measures of experiences with violence and injustice. The first was a measure of lifetime exposure to violence, which was done in an interview called the MyETV, which measures lifetime exposure to violence both as a victim and as a witness to violence. The possible range of scores on this measure can be from 0 to 16, and we found a mean of 6. However, the range was, I think, 2 to 13. So we had, huge individual differences in this sample in terms of the extent to which they've been previously exposed to different kinds of violence. The second measure is that we were also interested in more proximal experiences or more recent experiences that youth were going through in their schools. So we also had a measure of youth's recent experiences of victimization at school. So in the last month. And the possible range of scores here was from 1 to 5. We found a mean of 1.4, which is a good thing. Most youth were not exposed to high levels of victimization. But nevertheless, there were variations in terms of youth's experiences at school. So, in terms of how these measures are related to retaliation, we found that both measures, so both lifetime exposure to violence as well as current experiences of victimization, were associated with expressing retaliatory desires in peer conflict. So youth exposed to higher levels of violence and victimization were more likely to talk about wanting retaliation. This seemed to be particularly the case in non-forgiveness accounts. So the association was stronger when youth talked about non-forgiveness. And it was especially the case in terms of what I was calling other harmful actions, not tit for tat or an eye for an eye. So these actions that tended to be escalatory and violent. We also found that exposure to violence was related to descriptions of actually acting out these retaliatory desires. So not only was it related to the desires themselves, but it was related to not containing them, but actually acting them out instead. And finally, we found that current victimization, but not lifetime exposure to violence, was related to youth's positive judgments of their own retaliation. So when they retaliated, saying it was a good thing that they did. Now, recall that basically everyone said that forgiveness was a good thing. So we couldn't really look at how that was related to exposure to violence. However, there was quite a bit more variation in terms of whether you thought non-forgiveness was a good thing. So we were able to see how that was correlated with lifetime exposure to violence and victimization. We found that it was only related to current victimization at school, and so youth who were currently being victimized or who were, being beat up at school, who were having their stuff stolen, they tended to make more positive judgments of non-forgiveness. Okay, so trying to put it all together in terms of what we have learned so far, I think we have much more to learn, but in terms of the lessons we can draw from these data, I think the first and a very clear message is that intersections between retaliation and forgiveness are complex. Youth described wanting to retaliate and actually retaliating equally when they were talking about forgiveness and non-forgiveness experiences. If youth are retaliating in situations where they ultimately forgive, this suggests some distortions in youth's capacities to move beyond conflicts constructively. Like, what does that mean in terms of your relationships going forward if, people are punching people in the face and then reconciling? Certainly, our data also suggests that youth reason about revenge, forgiveness, and non-forgiveness in multifaceted ways that suggest really there is some unique value of asking them to reflect on their own experiences. They bring many concerns to bear on their understandings and judgments of peer conflicts, including their histories of relationships with other people, their concerns with justice and harm, and their social motivations, to name just a few examples. And finally, our data suggests that youth's experiences of violence and injustice are related to how they construct meanings about peer experiences. In this sense, by examining how youth make sense of and understand peer conflicts, we get a sense of how things go wrong, but we can hopefully also gain some insight into how to set things right again. So in terms of implications, I think our research diverges somewhat from other studies of retaliation in youth, in that, we think about desires for revenge as in some ways being a sort of understandable or comprehensible response to being deeply hurt. However, we believe it's crucial to find ways to help youth turn away from those desires for retaliation. So I think two promising directions in our data are, first of all, helping youth recognize where these desires come from, so their own emotions or beliefs or goals that account for their wishes to get back at others, so to understand their own psychology around, why are they experiencing these desires to, insult somebody's mother or punch them in the face when they're hurt. And also, in turn, supporting them in finding ways of containing these desires. So in terms of controlling their own emotions, in terms of reflecting on their own personal commitments or the kind of person that they want to be, and also, bringing in their more generalized judgments of hurtful behavior. So recognizing that this does fit into the general category of hurtful behaviors that they tend not to condone. Our data also imply that forgiveness can be supported in multiple ways. So they suggest multiple avenues that we may want to explore. First of all, in terms of promoting adolescents' ability to express remorse and make reparations, this is not in terms of the person who was harmed, but what we saw is that when people were harmed, expressing remorse or trying to repair went a long way towards helping youth move beyond those conflicts. Second, we can leverage youth's strong desires to maintain positive relationships with their peers. Third, helping youth move away from a tit-for-tat mentality or an eye-for-an-eye mentality, and helping them recognize the personal and social benefits of moving beyond conflict without retaliating and the capacity to forgive. But at the same time, I think it's also important to acknowledge youth's legitimate desires to protect themselves from harm and to stand up for their own rights. So this needs to come alongside all of these other concerns. So before I finish, I would just like to thank the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, which gave us money to do this project, as well as my co-investigators, our student collaborators who really played a fundamental role in this project, both in Bogota and in Montreal, as well as, last and most importantly, our school partners and the youth themselves who participated, without whom this research would simply not have been possible. So, thank you. If you'd like to ask me a question in Spanish as opposed to English, I am sure Roberto would not mind translating. Is that right? Okay.
I want to make a question about a research that we have been done here in Colombia with families that are with war conflicts and displacement. And these are families that have kids from 0 to 5 years old, so it's first early in childhood. And we have been working with them, trying to understand the experience of child reading in those adverse conditions.
Yeah.
And when we were talking with them about discipline practices, and we found that because when I'm asking this question, trying to relate your work with the type of results that we found.
Right.
And these families were families that has a lot of early experience of violence. We would say that this was not a huge sample, but the group of families, we tried to explore with them in a more qualitative way their own early childhood experience with their families, and then how it was related with their, now they are the caregivers.
Right.
And we found things like this. In discipline practices, they have phrases, a way of speaking about discipline that we think that are more related to macro-social way of thinking in this society about violence, about like revenge. It was like if the kid that we were talking about from 0 to 5 years old, if he do something, he's misbehaving, and he sometimes kids when they are like 3, 4, or 5, they learn how to run because they are going to have physical punishment, and they say, maybe I cannot do it right now, but tonight, in a moment that I can cut him, I will do it. They use a phrase like, he will pay.
Right.
So revenge, when I was listening to you and then thinking about our results, I say, it's like there are belief in our social way of rearing children that revenge is something that is in everyday life experiences. So you are in another moment of the life cycle that are adolescents, but we think these are adults, and we have I was thinking about, we have some macro-social ideas, believing that if somebody do something hard to you, is harmful to you, you have to do revenge. It's like pegging. So I say, my question is about intervention. How we change this, because it's like we need to work with the families, with the adults that are in charge of kids to teach them, like self-reflecting, that type of strategies, like what interpersonal relationships, not having revenge, not making forgiveness is something that is going to intrapersonal problems, but also intrapersonal.
Exactly, yeah.
So for me something. My question is about. This is more. Is not in the micro system, but it's also in the macro social issue. It's a micro social issue. How to work this to do changes that goes beyond interpersonal relationships.
I think the questions you're asking are so important. I don't think that enough people have done research on, essentially what you're studying is intergenerational transmission of risk, right? We know when parents themselves have experienced trauma, how does that translate into their parenting practices and in the ways that, they make sense of the world that then, changes the nature of the basic relationships they're forming early on with their children. One person who I think has written in a way that you may find interesting about this issue is William Arsenio. He's interested in the development of early attachment relationships, and he makes an argument that under normal circumstances, when people are not exposed to violence, people develop an understanding of relationships as characterized by caring and reciprocity. But when things go very badly, that changes to an understanding of relationships as fundamentally guided by dominance and coercion. And so, that follows you throughout your life. I think Cecilia will speak to the wide-ranging effects of trauma in her talk, and it goes beyond PTSD, right? It affects how you interact with your children, how you make sense of your life, how you think about yourself. And so I wish if I had the answer to this question, I think I would win the Nobel Prize. But I think it's a very complicated thing to work through, both in terms of helping the parents do things differently, and also in terms of helping the kids. So yes, I'm glad you're doing this work, though. I would love, maybe Roberto can give me your email address, because I'd love to keep in touch and hear more about what you're doing. I'm supervising a student who's doing work with young mothers in Uganda, in northern Uganda, and she's interested in some of the same issues in terms of supporting resilience in the next generation of parents.
Thank you very much for this wonderful presentation, Professor Holly, and I'm very glad to see that you're working on our context here in Colombia. I have two questions for you.
Okay.
The first is regarding the explanation you make. I wonder if you have made a hypothesis regarding the cultural or social factors that you think are involved in this situation of revenge that you are explaining and describing us. As regards the comparison you make to other neighborhoods in the USA, I was wondering if you compare this. You said you have like kind of parallels, but in a way we don't have the same context. So I wonder if you perhaps deepen this line of explanation that you can make regarding the behaviors that you find here in the Colombian children. And my second question is regarding the theoretical implications of your work. You mentioned this differentiation between reactive, proactive aggression models, and as well you mentioned the social domain theory. So I was wondering, besides this research about revenge as such, do you have any other theoretical implications regarding these two broad explanations about morality? Thank you.
Thank you. Those are good ones. So your first question was about, understanding the Colombian context and, issues around comparing it to the American context. And I have to say I am reluctant to draw direct comparisons in some ways between the two samples, because there are a multitude of factors that are different in terms of the sorts of experiences that youth in middle-class schools in Utah are having versus the experiences that youth in urban Bogota are having, right? I mean, I think the study is organized around the issue of differences in terms of violence and injustice in those two sets of adolescents, but I would certainly acknowledge their differences as well. I think the nice thing about the design that we have is we can sort of think about what pattern are we seeing in Colombian youth as a whole, and how does that look compared to the pattern that we're seeing in American adolescents, but we can also compare within the Colombian sample in terms of the different kinds of experiences that youth are having. The thing that we've been talking about that's challenging is, even for the youth who haven't been directly exposed to violence in their everyday lives in Colombia, what does it mean to live in a society where, you've essentially been in a state of internal armed conflict for 60 years? And, certain aspects of Colombian society, like knowing that, there's a certain level of corruption in the government that, everyone experiences. Like it's a ubiquitous experience in Colombia. So in the States, there are certainly problems, right? Not everybody trusts the police. Like not everybody believes that you can call the police and that they'll come and help you. And that varies a lot from neighborhood to neighborhood. But there is, to some degree, like a basic trust in the system that I'm not sure it exists here to the same extent. Part of how, revenge has been thought about in general in honor cultures, which, Colombia would be characterized as an honor culture, so the theorizing around this is that when you don't have institutional trust, so when you don't believe that there's a system in place where, justice will be done and that you can count on authorities to do that justice, well, who then is responsible for making sure justice happens? It really is more like vigilante justice, like it's taken more into your own hands. And that's true even in cultures where, these honor mentalities kind of continue to exist, but violence is no longer a prevalent part of the culture. So in a way, there's sort of a double whammy, I think, going on here, where there's an honor culture that's been embedded to some degree in Latin American culture for a long time. Then there's also, in the present, a lot of violence going on in society. So I think that might answer partly your first question in terms of some of the processes that we've been thinking about. The second question in terms of the theoretical framework for the study. In a way, as far as the reactive-proactive distinction, I think it's a really helpful theoretical distinction because it speaks to the functions of aggression. But at the same time, I think that largely in the literature, retaliatory aggression has been equated with reactive aggression. I think the way that people actually study retaliation, they're assuming that it's reactive. But what we're seeing is that there really are what look like, yes, definitely reactive motivations underlying the way that youth are responding. So they're really mad, they're not thinking through the situation, they're just lashing out in response to being provoked. That sounds like what people think of as reactive aggression. But we really do see instances of retaliation that sound more proactive as well. So they sound goal-directed, they sound calculated in the way that people talk about proactive aggression. So I think it might be a fruitful direction to consider retaliation in terms of these different forms and functions that it can take. I think the broader theoretical frame for this study is social domain theory to a large degree, which really posits that no matter where youth are growing up, no matter what the circumstances, for the most part, youth nevertheless tend to make moral judgments that are universalizable and generalizable, that hurting people is wrong, right? So there's been pretty good research done internationally suggesting that, across many, many circumstances, if you ask youth, is it okay to be unfair? Is it okay to be hurtful? You'd say, no, it is not. And for real moral reasons, right, pertaining to others' welfare and issues of justice. However, these issues around reasoning about justice and welfare seem to be distorted somewhat when we get into situations of talking about retaliation. So So in other words, youth seem to be applying these understandings of justice in ways that are actually leading them to positive judgments of retaliation. So this is the puzzle that we're really trying to solve right now in terms of how they get there, despite their general belief that hurting people is the wrong thing to do. And what it means that they're behaving in ways that they know are hurtful to others while knowing that hurting others is wrong. So what I think Cecilia will speak more to the impact that that has in the long term on youth's sense of themselves as moral agents.
Well, Holly, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts and your research with us. I think this work is really interesting, especially in the stage of affairs that we are here in Colombia, in light of a possible peace treaty, and looking at how are we going to deal with all this retaliation intentions and the possibility of forgiveness with all the conflict that we have lived. So in terms of intervention and all the implications that this research has for intervention, I think that one way we can look at it, that you didn't show, but I'm pretty sure that you have thoughts about it, is at in terms of what factors could prevent children from wanting to enact retaliation or from wanting to forgive. And I'm thinking of probably individual attributes or peer relations, family relationships, or school climate. How those factors can be related to the way that children are reasoning about retaliation and forgiveness. And I was wondering if you have any thoughts, or have you done any research that can give us some light on those attributes that we can actually intervene with the education system.
Thank you. I'm actually hoping when we have dinner later this week you can tell me more about this, but I'll try now. So really this study, I didn't talk too much about it, I didn't talk all about it today, but the study was designed with the notion in mind that really the best location of intervention is the schools, right? In terms of, where we can get the most bang for our buck, that schools are going to play a really important role. And so in the study, we also included measures of school climate. In terms of what we were particularly interested in, so I was speaking to your colleague about the idea of institutional trust, so youth's beliefs that there's a system that's in place that can protect you, that can keep things in line. We didn't measure that at the societal level, but we did measure it at the school level. So is my school a place where people care about each other? Is my school a place where I can go to a teacher and I'll actually get a response that will help? Is my school a place where people can count on each other? I think that your research, in addition to other people's, shows that school climate and classroom climate really can make a big difference in terms of the sorts of interactions you see between peers. So if we can find ways to create school environments that create this sense of caring and trust as opposed to dominance and coercion, then that would help. Right? That would be part of the solution.
Gracias. Thanks, Holly.